For Christians, all history is divided into two parts: the years before the birth of Christ and the years afterward. However, the transition from Old Testament to New Testament, from Old Covenant to New Covenant, didn't happen overnight. To be sure, nearly 400 years passed between the last days of the prophets and the coming of Christ. The world into which Jesus brought his good news was directly shaped by these long centuries, a time of homelessness, dispersion, and changing religious practice by the Jewish people. It was a process of cause and effect. One after another, a series of conquering powers uprooted the Jews from their homeland. These political upheavals spread the Jewish religion into a wider world. In that dispersion, Judaism, the Old Covenant community, was transformed. And that transformation in turn made it possible for the good news of a Jewish-born Messiah to spread rapidly outward into the Gentile world. To understand how the New Testament world of the first century was formed, we're going to take a journey through the events leading up to it. Dr. Robert Mulholland, Dean of the School of Theology of Asbury Theological Seminary, guides us through those last centuries before the birth of Christ, the time we call the intertestamental period.
In 587 BC, after about 500 years of relative independence, the Babylonian exile plunged Israel into 400 years of subordination to ruling powers. This experience transformed the life of the Old Covenant community and prepared the way for both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. Biblically, the period is clothed in mystery. Only the books of Haggai and Zechariah, from around 520 BC, Ezra and Nehemiah, from around 465 to 430 BC, and Daniel, from about 168 BC, provide glimpses into this period. The Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem created two major centers of Jewish population: Babylon, where a large portion of the Jewish people were taken into captivity, and Egypt, where many Jews fled to escape Babylonian exile. During the next 500 years, Jews spread from these two centers to become diaspora Judaism, inhabiting the entire Mediterranean basin. In Babylon, the Jews wrestled with the problem of how to be God's covenant people without the sacrificial cultus of the temple. The answer was to live in daily obedience to the Torah, the law of Moses. Exiled priests became teachers of the law. The gathered community, or synagogue, became the center for reading and instruction in the Torah. During the century following the Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BC, several small groups of exiled Jews returned to Jerusalem. The Jerusalem temple was rebuilt and the sacrificial cultus reinstituted. Accompanying the cultus, however, there gradually emerged a body of lay teachers of the law, the scribes, who continued the development of Torah interpretation which had begun in Babylon. Thus, the temple and its priestly sacrificial cultus was no longer the sole expression of the Jewish faith. The synagogue and the scribal teaching of Torah became an increasingly powerful center of Jewish life. During the Persian period, there emerged a small core of priests and wealthy Jewish aristocracy who became the representatives of Palestinian Judaism to the Persian rulers. As this group became increasingly drawn into the politics, economics, and culture of the Persian world, a split began to develop between this ruling aristocracy and the common people who sought to live in obedience to the scribal interpretation of the Torah. Following Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia from 333 to 323 BC, Palestine fell first under the domination of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt and then the Seleucid kingdom of Syria. Especially under Seleucid control, the Hellenistic culture exercised powerful influence upon the ruling aristocracy of the Jews. Increasing resistance on the part of the faithful followers of the scribes, known as the Hasidim, finally erupted in the Maccabean Revolution. The descendants of Judas Maccabeus, known as the Hasmoneans, finally led the Jews of Palestine into a century of independence, which ended with Rome's conquest in 63 BC. Three groups vital to the New Testament period emerged from the time of the Hasmonean independence. Two groups emerged from the pious Hasidim, who had fueled the Maccabean Revolution: the Essenes, a separatist group of zealous pietists, and the Pharisees, who sought to live lives of priestly holiness in the midst of the world by strict observance of the teachings of the scribes. The ruling aristocracy of the high priestly families and wealthy Jews banded around the Hasmonean kings and came to be known as the Sadducees. By the later years of the Hasmonean rule, two groups of writings had become authoritative for the Jews: the Law of Moses and the Prophets, which also included the historical books of our Old Testament. With these was a large third group, known simply as the Writings, which included such biblical books as Daniel, Psalms, Proverbs, Esther, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Job, together with a large body of writings now known as the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. Many of these writings were apocalyptic in their perspective, looking for God's final victory over the forces of evil which had ruled the world and oppressed the people of God. While various influences nurtured the development of these writings, the long Jewish experience of subordination to foreign rulers had created the hunger for a divine intervention to reestablish Israel as God's chosen people. In 63 BC, Pompey marched his Roman legions into Jerusalem. Once again, the Jews became a subject people. Roman oppression incited radical Pharisees to more zealous action in preparation for God's expected deliverance. The Zealots first emerged shortly after the Roman takeover and engaged in both covert and open resistance to Roman rule. Toward the middle of the 1st century AD, a more extreme faction of the Zealots, the Sicarii, began to engage in open rebellion against Rome through assassination of both Roman officials and Jewish collaborators with Rome. It was the activity of the Zealots and Sicarii which finally led to the outbreak of the Jewish war against Rome in 66 AD. Throughout the period of Roman rule, messianic expectations ran high among the Jews in Palestine. Both Jesus and John the Baptist were interrogated by Jewish authorities regarding their messianic pretensions. Jesus warned his followers against false messiahs, and Josephus and Acts both attest to the presence of such messianic pretenders in the 1st century. While the politically disenfranchised and economically disadvantaged looked for a revolutionary Messiah, others looked for a priestly Messiah, or even the intervention of a divine Son of Man to deliver them from Rome and inaugurate the kingdom of God. The economic imbalances of Palestine produced an increasingly wealthy upper class and an ever-growing pool of poverty and unemployment. It was in this pool of poverty and unemployment that messianic expectations ran high. From this pool, the Zealots and the Sicarii drew their followers, and from this pool came the multitudes which flocked to Jesus. Outside of Palestine, Judaism had spread throughout the Roman world. The synagogue was the structural center of these dispersed Jewish communities, and the scribal interpretation of Torah shaped their daily life. Judaism attracted many Gentiles with its strong monotheism, its supportive community structures, and its principles which gave life a coherent meaning and purpose in an often meaningless world. Some Gentiles undertook the separation from the Gentile world required to worship and participate in the Jewish community. These were known as God-fearers. Others took the steps necessary to become Jews and were known as proselytes. These two groups formed the bridge from the Jewish to the Gentile world, the bridge over which the gospel of Christ moved out of its Jewish setting into the larger Roman world.